Good evening, and welcome to you all from the members of this church. We're delighted that you've decided to be here with us this Good Friday evening. Before we begin, we'll take care of a few housekeeping details. Please turn off all cell phones and other electronic devices. Turn them off completely, as they will otherwise interfere with the sound system. Now we're all set for an evening of inspiration and joy. First, let's thank Third Church's organist, Todd Peters. You can hear more of Todd's rousing music at our Sunday morning services and Wednesday evening testimony meetings. Tonight we welcome a quartet of talented singers with multiple credits in choral singing, opera, and musical theater. Jenny Lynn Stewart, Emily Ellet, Blake Zolfo, and John Schenkel. They will warm our hearts with songs appropriate for Easter, and you may be asked to join in too. Now, let the music begin. I'll read passages from Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures by Mary Baker Eddy, the discoverer and founder of Christian Science. Jesus taught the way of life by demonstration, that we may understand how the divine principle heals the sick, casts out error, and triumphs over death.
To the mountain, Jesus is teaching. All who seek freedom can find your release.
Come to the mountain, Jesus is preaching, sharing the gospel of love and peace. Sharing the gospel of peace.
To the lakeside, Jesus is healing. Come touch the teacher of Galilee.
Come to the lakeside, truth is revealing. Wonders of mercy so rich and free. Mercy so rich and free. Come to the mountain, come rest in the Lord. Come, seekers of grace, come to the place where hope is restored. Come to where hope is restored. Come to the journey, Jesus is calling. Take up your cross and follow me. Come to the journey, walk in his footsteps. Trust in the shepherd wherever he leads. Trust him wherever he leads. Trust in the Lord.
Trust in the Lord.
Trust him wherever he leads.
Trust in the Lord with all your heart.
With
Trust
all
in the
your
Lord with
Trust
all
in
your
your
heart.
your
Your heart. Trust the Lord.
When Christ changes a belief of sin or of sickness into a better belief, then belief melts into spiritual understanding, and sin, disease, and death disappear.
Open my eyes that I may see. Show me the truth you have for me.
The true idea of God gives the true understanding of life and love, robs the grave of victory, takes away all sin and the delusion that there are other minds, and destroys mortality. The final demonstration of the truth which Jesus taught and for which he was crucified opened a new era for the world.
Jesus lives, God's power proclaim. Alleluia, praise his name. We're rejoicing every day. Love has rolled the stone away.
And here's a microphone. As a public speaker, Lona Ingwerson served on the board of lectureship for the Mother Church, the First Church of Christ Scientist in Boston, Massachusetts. Prior to entering the full-time practice of Christian Science, Lona was an actress, appearing in movies, on stage, on television, and on radio. Please help me welcome tonight Lona Ingwerson.
Thank you, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming here and into your living rooms and wherever you are out there not in La La Land. Well, maybe La La Land, too. That was a great introduction. Thank you. Who were you talking about? Oh, that's interesting. The only thing I should correct you on, though, is you said that I was a lifelong Christian Scientist, and actually, I've really only been active in it since I was maybe 2.5. Until then, I was theologically confused about everything. Theologically confused, too, about the topic of this talk tonight, because what's good about Good Friday? I used to think, why would they name it that? It was a catastrophic day, the worst possible day in the universe. But then I realized it was the forerunner of the absolutely greatest day in the universe. And so that's what we're going to be celebrating. But tonight we're going to take that story from beginning to end. First of all, we talked about why we had to have the crucifixion. It was in order to have the resurrection. You can't have a resurrection without a crucifixion. But why did we have to have a resurrection? Well, there were a couple of reasons. The minor one might have been that it was already in prophecy that we had to have that. But the other was that Jesus, who could have ascended, he did eventually anyway, why did he go through that? He went through it for us, for you and me, because he was giving us, in the only way we could get it, proof of the most important thing we worry about, we fear, but we never talk about, even to our closest friends and family members. Is life eternal or not? And how could he have proven it in any other way to us? 30 times in the Bible it says life is eternal, but we don't get it by just reading it. He had to prove it to us. Now, whether we take that and believe it or not is going to be up to us. But he did prove it. I figure we've got 3 types of people in our audience all over the world here. We have people who are very dedicated Christians, people who absolutely believe the word of the Bible, who don't need to hear anything else but to know that his proof was all they needed to show them life was eternal. And then we have a totally different group who don't believe it at all, or maybe have never even heard of it. My daughter was saying the other day that her mom was giving a speech on resurrection, and the lady, a professional, said, "What's resurrection? I never did know what Easter's about." And I think a lot of people are that way, it seems, sure. And I hope that both dedicated people who know that Bible, group 1, know the story, find in it, in the next hour, something about that story they hadn't heard before. My prayer for those who've not heard the story is that it begin to prove to you that there is something out there called eternal life. And for those of us in the middle, Malcolm in the middle, and that's most of us, we do know the story. We do know about the crucifixion. We do know about the resurrection. But is it true? Is that really true for me too? That's kind of what I wondered. Is life really eternal? And it's kind of, we feel like that man in the Bible who said, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. So I want to address you as well. In the next hour, I hope that each group can change a bit and have a more joyous Easter because of hearing some of this glorious story. And I'm going to tell you the story from beginning to end. And you may have heard the story before in different ways, because the 4 who recorded it, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, weren't actually there, all of them, to see all of this. Some of them weren't there at all. But they
pieced the story together. The important thing is that they got the story right. Not whether this little detail is different from Mark and different from John. That's immaterial. It's kind of like being at the scene of an accident, isn't it? The point is you have to get the details of the accident. Whose fault was it? Rather than how many passengers were in that car and did they have a hat on and all of that. So we're going to stick to the basic story. I'm going to combine a little bit of Matthew, a little bit of Mark, a little bit of Luke, a little bit of John, maybe a little bit of Lona as well, although I don't really belong in that category. But we're going to get the story across, okay? First of all, I want to talk to you about this business of believing I mentioned a minute ago. There is a very little-known poem about that, written by a man named William Carruth, a poet from a few decades ago. Listen to what he's saying. It's kind of interesting. A fire mist and a planet, a crystal and a cell, a jellyfish and a dinosaur and a cave where cavemen dwell. Then, a sense of law and order, a face turned from a clod. Some folks call that evolution. Others call it God. A haze on the far horizon, the infinite tender sky, the ripe rich tint of the cornfields and wild geese flying high, the highlands and the lowlands ablaze with their beautiful hues. Some folks call that autumn. Others just call it God. A picket frozen on duty, a mother starved for her child, Socrates drinking the hemlock, Jesus remaining mild, and millions of nameless people, the long, hard pathway trod. Some call that consecration. Others call that God. So what do we call Easter? A day to remember the agony of the cross, or a day to rejoice in the beauty of the crown. The Easter story didn't begin with the crucifixion. It actually began between 450 and 1,000 years prior to that, because it was prophesied. Nearly everything about that Easter story had been written hundreds of years before, and they were all fulfilled in the crucifixion and the resurrection. But there were over 300 prophecies written about Jesus, all of them fulfilled. I am not going to go over all 300 because you might want to get home before Easter, but I'll highlight a few of them. These are things Jesus could never have controlled, by the way. Micah prophesied that Jesus would be a descendant of King David, and he was. There was a prophecy that Jesus would be born in Bethlehem, and as you know, he was. There was a prophecy that someone would come before him and announce his coming, and John the Baptist took care of that. There were prophecies that Jesus would not open his mouth. He would be led like a lamb to the slaughter. Now, we use that term. We're going to find tonight a lot of terms we use now that started then. You're going to see that fulfilled throughout the Easter story, that Jesus was very careful with his words. It was prophesied that he would be despised and rejected of men, and we certainly see that in the trial. That the soldiers would divide his garments and cast lots for them, and one of his bones would be broken. None of his bones would be broken. That's an interesting one. Pretty graphic. But there was a Jewish holiday coming up on Sunday, High Sabbath, and they had a law that you could not have anyone hanging on a cross on High Sabbath. Didn't look good from the temple, okay? So they've got 3 guys that were candidates. 3 of them are hanging on a cross, and High Sabbath is approaching. 2 of them were the thieves you've heard about, and then 1 was Jesus. So they had to check them out and make sure they were dead before they could take them down. They checked out the thieves, and they weren't. So they took care of that by breaking their legs. Probably none of us have hung on a cross and know just what that is, but I assume you sort of brace yourself in the back to slow the process down. When they broke their legs, the men made their transition very quickly. And then they went over to check out Jesus. Now Jesus, who had been there at the same time, was already dead. But they wanted to make absolutely sure of that. So they pierced his hands and his feet to draw blood and water to make absolutely sure. And he was. But that fulfilled another prophecy, which was that his hands and feet would be pierced. It's pretty strong stuff, but he went through quite a bit for you and for I. I also back up the crucifixion story for just a few days to last Sunday, Palm Sunday, because it too fulfilled prophecy. It was prophesied that Jesus would be brought into town on the colt of a donkey, that palm fronds would be laid at his feet, and that's Palm Sunday. The crowds adored him. They were yelling, "Praise God for the Son of David. Bless the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Praise God in highest heavens." They absolutely worshiped and adored Jesus. They even put their own clothing, their overcoats, their topcoats, on top of the palm fronds so that the donkey would have a better walk and Jesus would be more comfortable. They adored and loved this man. And the only reason I bring it up is because on Good Friday, the crowds showed up to yell, "Crucify him." What happened between Palm Sunday and Good Friday? Researchers have not been able to prove that they were exactly the same crowd, but it is thought that they were. That those loyal Christians flipped over when the people got a hold of them with some crowd control techniques. Something for us to be wary of too, isn't it? To allow your thinking to be manipulated by, well, everyone else is doing this. Everyone else cheated on their income tax. Everyone else. It's too easy to go along with the crowd. You know, we tell our teenagers not to follow the crowd, but to follow the Christ. But we adults need to do a bit more of that too. When I think of that crowd, I think of a little rat, a little rodent, a lemming. Maybe you're all familiar with lemmings, but they have a rather interesting pattern. They run in packs and they follow a leader. And the leader inevitably leads them to their death. It had been thought for many centuries that they were simply suicidal. But later researchers have decided that they are the unfortunate result of their migratory behavior. But that's what they do. They just follow the leader to extinction. And it's kind of easy for us to do the same. Think for yourself. There's a lesson in this wonderful story for each of us to apply to our modern day. So now we're kind of going to get into this story here a bit. Because the next thing that happens is that Judas cuts a deal. And I think everyone knows about that. That the hierarchy wanted to get rid of Jesus. He was a threat to them. And they had to find someone weak enough who would betray him, who would help them get hold of him. That wasn't going to be an easy task. So Judas was the weak link. And he agreed to, in essence, sell out Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Now, when you think of that deal, you think, my word, it must have meant millions and millions of dollars. It's interesting. The value of 30 pieces of silver in today's currency would be $600. So for that, he sold him out. And he developed a plan that actually began with the Passover dinner. Now we call it, for obvious reasons, the Last Supper. Jesus knew exactly how it would play out. He asked his disciples to go find a place to eat and told them exactly who to go to contact to get the place, and then said, almost as an aside, "My time has come." I don't think they heard that. I don't think they had a clue as to what was going to happen. But as they sat down to dinner, a story began to unfold, but I still don't think they quite got it. And as they did eat, he said, "Verily I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me. Woe unto that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It had been good for that man if he had not been born." Pretty strong words. Judas hears it, immediately comes over and says, "Oh, is it I?" And here we have that wonderful line that was prophesied, that Jesus would not open his mouth. All he said was, "Thou sayest." He didn't get involved in some inane dialogue, some rationale to the other disciples. What would the other disciples have done? They would have been incredulous at this. In fact, they were so confused by what Jesus was saying that they said, Is it us? Is it I? Each one of them thinking, what have I done wrong? What does he mean that one of us will betray him? Maybe they thought he would just have a bad night or something. What have I done? You know, I think of the two kinds of sins we have: the sin of commission and the sin of omission. With the sin of commission, you're committing a crime. You're doing something very wrong, and that's what Judas was doing. But with the sin of omission, it isn't that you're doing something wrong. It's just that you're not doing something right, not quite right. I can't imagine what those disciples were thinking. Same thing we would have. Should I have followed him to Nazareth more closely? Should I have not stayed home that morning? Should I have been there with the loaves and fishes and had the loaves and fishes in my hand? What could I have done for the master that I haven't done? You know, that sense of guilt and urgency we have. What could I have done? Well, you're going to see in a few minutes there were some things they could have done, but at that point they were simply confused as to what he was talking about and had no clue as to the urgency of the situation. So after dinner, they do something they traditionally did. They go over it. Now it's getting toward evening. They go to the Mount of Olives. This is not climbing Kilimanjaro, for heaven's sake. The Mount of Olives is about 948 feet elevation. So they go there and they sing hymns. And there's a plateau close to the mount that's called the Garden of Gethsemane. And so after they sang their hymns, they went to the garden, and Jesus began to tell them what was coming. And as they did eat, verily I say unto you, I am exceeding sorrowful. And every one of them began to say, Why? And he said, All ye shall be offended because of me this night. You know, we think offended? Well, if someone hurts my feelings, I'm offended. Well, he was saying your feelings are going to be hurt big time tonight. Jesus then said, It is written, I will smite the shepherd, that's him, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered abroad, that's them. But after that, I am risen again. I will go before you into Galilee. He was telling them that he was going to be smitten, they were going to scatter, and he was going to rise again. He gave them the whole scenario. I don't think they quite got it at that point. Now Peter speaks up. Jesus had said that they would scatter, and Peter wants to assure him that he will be faithful, no matter what, even if it means his death. He said, and I quote, Though all men shall be offended because of thee, yet will I never be offended. Jesus said unto him, Verily I say unto thee, that this night before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. Peter said unto him, Though I should die with thee, yet will I not deny thee. Likewise said all of the disciples. The disciples split about as fast as they could that night. Wasn't it Harry Truman who said, when the heat gets hot, you get out of the kitchen? But at any rate, they got out as fast as they could. When the soldiers showed up, Peter was indicating, of course, that he was going to stay, even if it meant his death. Jesus knew better. Jesus knew the whole scenario. But evidently it hurt Jesus' feeling that Peter, whom he kind of considered a best friend, was going to betray him. Even that had been prophesied. Isaiah had said, speaking of the Master, It is not an enemy who taunts me. I could bear that. It's not my foes who so arrogantly insult me. I could have hidden from them. Instead, it's you, my equal, my companion, my close friend. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you considered a very, very close friend? could you still love them? Jesus did. Jesus now takes 3 men apart from the rest of the disciples. They're all still out there in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's asked them, in a sense, to watch, to support him. But he takes the 3 aside, fell on the ground, and prayed. Have you ever done that? You know, you think, oh, I pray maybe sitting in my chair, I pray at church, I may bow my head, but Jesus went to the ground. And one of the apostles said he actually fell on his face to pray. He was in a bit of agony that night, knowing exactly what was coming. He had asked those 3 especially to watch. He was only going to go a few feet from them. I don't think he wanted them to see him on the ground like that. But he needed their support. That's why he pulled those 3 aside. And when he went back to them, and I think probably you all know the story, he found every one of them asleep. And that was a disappointment. And he said, Peter, Simon, sleepest thou? Couldst thou not watch 1 hour? Watch ye and pray, lest ye enter into temptation. The spirit truly is ready, but the flesh is weak. There's another story, another line we hear all the time. The spirit is ready, but the flesh is weak. And again he went away and prayed and spake the same words, and when he returned, he found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. Neither wist they what to answer him. They didn't know what to say. They didn't even know what to pray about. They were at a loss, and so they went to sleep. And when he came back, he simply said, sleep on now. Take your rest. It's enough. The one thing the master asked of them, and here we get into that sin of omission, was that they watch with him, and they couldn't do it. You say, well, if I were asked to watch for an hour, I would surely do that. Now I'm going to digress a minute and think, most of our church services last an hour. And I understand that across the board, church congregations are sliding fast, diminishing congregations. Well, yeah, but see, my kid has a soccer game on Sunday morning, and that's when the golf course is open, and I really need to sleep in a little bit more. And I go to church religiously. That would be Christmas and Easter, and I have my church at the mountains or at the beach. You know, I live at the beach. I've never seen anyone have a church service down there, to be really honest. So we have a lot of excuses for not giving an hour. You said it would be of great benefit to us. We kind of know that. It would be a great benefit to our churches. You know, I wonder why it is that when the terrorists strike, often they strike at a church, a mosque, a temple, because that's where people worship. That's where people have the tightest bonds, the closest connections. They don't go to Walmart to strike. They're going to strike at a place of worship. Those are the people with whom you may argue, but you have more in common than with any other group in your town. They're your people, whoever they are, wherever they are. And it's so, I just think it's kind of been a sin of omission on our parts, all of our parts, that we sort of let that slide away. Could you not watch with me 1 hour? Just an interesting question. And then it happens. Jesus knew it would. I quote the Bible. Jesus said, "The hour is come. Behold, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise up, let me go. Lo, he that betrayed me is at hand." Immediately, now no one's been seen yet, but immediately from out the hiding place comes Judas leading a big band of soldiers, heavily armed. Now he's given them a sign because, you know, they don't have at the Garden of Gethsemane big floodlights. So how are they going to know which one is Jesus? They got a dozen guys out there. And so Judas said, "Don't worry about it. I'm going to give him a kiss. And then you grab him, okay?" So he comes up to Jesus and says, Master, Master, gives him a kiss, and they grab him immediately and bind him so he can't get away. Okay. And he that betrayed him had given them a token, saying, Whomsoever I shall kiss, that same is he, take him, lead him away. And as soon as he was come, he goeth straightway to him, and saith, Master, Master, and kissed him. And a disciple, all of a sudden the disciples realize something terrible is happening. And they're angry. And the disciples cuts off the right ear of a high priest. And what does Jesus do? He heals him. Heals the ear. Jesus was a man of love. Think about that. Could I forgive someone who had tried to kill myself or a member of my family? Could I even forgive the car mechanic who doesn't do a good job, for heaven's sake? Wow. But Jesus' mission was one of love. One of love. You know, we have a textbook in our church, Christian Science, and I think some of you out there may not have a clue as to what Christian Science is all about, and I'm not going to try to explain it at all in any great length, but we are a Bible-based church. So Bible-based that, believe it or not, we don't have a rabbi, we don't have a priest, we don't even have a minister. One of our members has been selected to simply read at the church service from the King James Version of the Bible. Bible has precedence with us. But we also have another book that really has been a great help to us. It's called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures by Mary Baker Eddy, the founder, the discoverer of Christian Science. This book does not take the place of a Bible. I think of it more as a word in that title. It's a key. A key opens a door to give the access to the treasure that's inside. But it isn't itself the treasure. It opens the door to the treasure, to the treasures of the Bible. And sometimes in this talk, I'm going to be quoting this book, so now I don't have to re-explain it each time. But I wanted to quote the definition of Gethsemane in Science and Health. Patient woe. Love meeting no response, but still remaining love. That's tough, but that was Jesus. You know, in the Old Testament, Moses gave us that wonderful 10 Commandments. They're the rules by which we live. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, etc., etc., etc. But when Jesus came along in the New Testament, he gave us 2 commandments. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and all thy soul and all thy mind. And the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. That was Jesus, and that was the man who healed the ear of the man who came for him. This love that Jesus had was epitomized to me very nicely in a poem written in our Christian Science periodicals, back in the 1930s. It's a poem about Jesus. You know, we don't know much about Jesus between the time he was 12 and in that temple and the time when he started his ministry in his early 30s. So we've got a gap there. But we have surmised that probably because his dad, Joseph, was a carpenter, that he was working with his dad in carpentry. And on that basis, she has written this poem, Jacqueline Shaw, called Conversation at Nazareth. Yes, he told me something. I asked him, I said, what love is? Wait a minute. There was a carpenter down the village. He was right quick at it. I'd hear his plane and hammer go all day. And then at night he'd come and he'd sit quiet-like and talk to us. More than likely, he'd talk about love. He held that love was perfection. I don't know. That's a hard saying. Only God is perfect as I see it. But he said that men could be perfect too. What became of him? I don't know. I went away. I was away for around 10 years. I heard that he went away as far as Jerusalem. Perfection. Only God is perfect as I see it. But he said that we could be perfect too if we tried hard enough. saw God morning, noon, and night. But loving is hard too. Hey, can you love a mean man or a thief? A liar is even worse. Can you love those? I'd ask him that, and he'd look at me with those great eyes of his, and he'd say, oh, yes, just love God. The rest will come. There'll come a time they'll thieve no more, lie no more. If you just keep loving on, they'll come. And then he'd get up and stride, kind of quiet in all his movements down the street. I think he used to meet his mother there. Let's get back to the Garden of Gethsemane. And then Jesus had another question for the soldiers. Are ye come out as against a thief, with swords and with staves to take me? I was daily with you in the temple, and you took me not. He was saying, if you guys really wanted to get me, you could have had me at any time, but this is a very dramatic move you're making. It also, by the way, fulfilled prophecy, and he knew that. And so, at this point now, they've got him tied up. The disciples have gotten out of there as fast as they could, with the exception of one, Peter. Peter, though, was in hiding. He kind of wanted to be a part of the action, but not a part of the action. And so as they took Jesus away, Peter followed at a distance. 3 times he was asked if he wasn't one of those Christians with Jesus. Didn't I recognize you? Weren't you with him? No. I wrote a poem about that, which no one has published, called Deja Vu. And I'm going to have to show you how I do it, because I'm going to put quotation marks around the direct quotations from John 18. And you're going to think I'm quoting the same passage, but I'm not. Each time I do it, it's a different passage. Okay. When Jesus was being led into the palace of the high priest, quote John 18, Peter stood at the door without. And when asked if he were one of the disciples, quote John 18, Peter denied it and said, I am not. And outside, where the soldiers and servants made a fire, quote John 18, Simon Peter stood with them and warmed himself. And when Jesus was sent bound to the high priest, quote John 18, Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. Deja vu, all over again, as Yogi Berra would say. And when asked once again if he were one of the disciples, John 18, he denied it and said, I am not. And when asked if Peter had been in the garden with Jesus, quote John 18, Peter then denied again, and immediately the cock crew. And me? When what I believe is being challenged, what do? Do I take a stand for the Christ or warm my hands with the crowd? Am I hearing those angel voices or a distant cock-a-doodle-doo? The trial. You ready for the trial? It was a kangaroo court, if ever there was one. It was presided over by Pontius Pilate. Now, there's a little bit of a discussion among theologians about his role there. Because when you read some of the apostles, you get the distinct feeling that Pontius Pilate did not want to be a part of that trial at all. His wife had had bad dreams about it, and she had said, don't have anything to do with this. He is a just man. But Pilate's going to lose his job and his credentials and maybe even his health plan. I don't know if he resigns at the moment. So he's kind of watching out for himself as well. So he even asked a lead question that could have gotten Jesus immediately down. He asked him, art thou the king of the Jews? And Jesus, once again, in his infinite wisdom said, thou sayest. Had he admitted that he was king of the Jews, which, by the way, he had never said, that would have been immediately execution, because now you're declaring you're the king. But he wouldn't do it. And they continued to ask him questions, and he continued to say absolutely nothing, which blew them away. He didn't try to defend himself. How many times have we done that? How many times have we wished later, I wish I hadn't done that, but I had to have the last word. I had to defend myself. Wow. I heard a story the other day of a guy who said he was so grateful his wife had little feet because they were always in her mouth. You know, foot and mouth disease, okay? So Jesus was so far above all of that. And they continued to ask him questions. He continued to say nothing. And in the meantime, Judas is beginning to have second thoughts. Oh, wow. You know, sometimes you buy a used car and wish you hadn't, and think, I wonder if I could get my money back. Or maybe you sell something you wish you hadn't, and you say, could I please give you my money back? He tried it. He tried it. And it didn't work. He was feeling totally guilty. Realized now what he had done, that it was a travesty. And he went to the temple to return the 30 pieces of silver. And they virtually laughed at him. They said, we don't want your silver. We have what we wanted. We have Jesus now. Now what's he going to do? He threw the 30 pieces of silver on the floor of the temple. And he departed, I quote the Bible, and went and hanged himself. Hadn't Jesus said at that Passover, the one who is betraying me will wish he had never been born? By the way, what are the priests going to do with that silver now? It's blood money. They can't put it back in the church coffers. What are they going to do with it? So they purchased a field where the indigent could be buried. It's called Potter's Field. And ever since then, that has been named the Field of Blood. And that, by the way, had been a prophecy. Okay. Quote, wherefore that field was called, this is from the Old Testament, the field of blood unto this day. Then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremy the prophet, saying, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him that was valued, whom they of the children of Israel did value, and gave them for the potter's field. And Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, here we go, art thou the King of the Jews? And Jesus said unto him, thou sayest. And when he was accused of the chief priests and elders, he answered, nothing. Then said Pilate unto him, hearest thou not how many things they witness against thee? I think Pilate was trying to draw him out. You've got to say something in your defense here. And he answered him, never a word, insomuch that the governor marveled greatly. Remember? Yet would not open his mouth, led like a lamb to the slaughter. Jesus, in his infinite wisdom, refused to be trapped into some inane dialogue. He knew what was going to happen anyway. Why give them more ammunition? Now, at that feast, the governor was wont to release unto the people a prisoner, whom they would. Okay, Houston, now we have a situation. Pilate has a possibility here. This is apart from the two thieves. They didn't count. But he can release either Barabbas, who is a known murderer, or he could release Jesus. But he has to appeal to the people because, again, you got to keep your job. You got to keep the people happy. We're politically here. So here's what the Bible said. And they had then a notable prisoner called Barabbas. Therefore, when they were gathered together, Pilate said unto them, whom will ye that I release unto you, Barabbas or Jesus, which is called Christ? But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitude that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. Crowd control. This is what I started with from Palm Sunday. Remember? The lemmings. They are the ones now who are crying out that they should take Jesus. The governor answered and said unto them, whether of the twain will ye that I release unto you? What shall I do then with Jesus, which is called Christ. They all say unto him, Let him be crucified. And the governor said, Why? What evil hath he done? And they cried out the more, saying, Let him be crucified. When Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but that rather a tumult was made, the crowd has gone crazy now, he did something that we'll never forget, written up in history. He took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. See ye to it. He literally, figuratively washed his hands of it. He took a basin of water, washed his hands, and left. I'm not going to be a part of this. And the people said, Fine, we'll take the blame for it. They said, His blood will be on us and on our children. You're off the hook, Pilate. Pilate, I wonder, though, how much he was off the hook. It's interesting because we don't hear much about this after this, about Pilate. But when Pilate was in his 40s, he was found drowned in a river. And no one ever knew he'd been killed, what had happened. They thought either he committed suicide or he was murdered because he had gone over to Christianity. And that wasn't a very popular thing to do at the time. Okay. So they released Barabbas, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Then the soldiers took Jesus into the common hall, gathered unto him the whole band of soldiers, and they stripped him, buck naked, and put on him a scarlet robe. Now they're going to have a lot of fun with him. They're going to dress him up like a king. So they put a scarlet robe on him, and then they had very carefully made a crown for him, a crown of thorns, which they plaited on his head. You've seen the pictures of the blood dripping down his face. And then they made a rod for him, because every king has got to have a rod. It was a big, heavy stick. And then they fell down on their knees, pretending to worship him, calling out, He's our king, King of the Jews. And after they had done that for a while, they started spitting on him, cursing him, mocking him in every way, took the rod, by the way, that they had made, the big heavy stick, and smote him on the head, hit him in the head, offered him vinegar seasoned with gall, which was poisoned, and of course he did not take that. It was a horrible scene, an unbelievable scene. And then they took him back to the hall, put on some of his clothes, enough to be crucified in, because they parted his garments, later cast lots for them, as you know, according to prophecy. And then they took him to the place of the skull. They started to prepare him for the crucifixion, and he started to say a few things at that point. One of the things we've all remembered that he said was the plaintive cry, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Some of them that stood there when they heard that said, this man is calling out for Elias. Let's see whether Elias will try to save him. Jesus, when he had cried again with a loud voice, yielded up the ghost. There comes another term we've used. He gave up the ghost. That was that was all going on between what they called the 6th and the 9th hour. And one of the apostles said that during that 3-hour time when he was giving up the ghost, that the earth went dark. And when he did give up the ghost, the veil of the temple was rent in twain. That was a massive, massive piece of cloth that was put in the temple to hide a very sacred piece, the covenant, from the rest of the people. And it absolutely shredded. And there was a massive earthquake. At that point, some of the people began to realize they'd made a terrible mistake. And one of the men, Cornelius, one of the men who had been instrumental with the soldiers, said, he truly was the Son of God. Okay. So, I'd like to quote from that book I spoke about a minute ago, Science and Health, because it's kind of interesting what was said here about that Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. I think we've thought about that. Mrs. Eddy said, the burden of that hour was terrible beyond human conception. The distrust of mortal minds, disbelieving the purpose of his mission, was 1,000,000 times sharper than the thorns which pierced his flesh. The real cross which Jesus bore up the hill of grief was the world's hatred of truth and love. Not the spear nor the material cross wrung from his faithful lips the plaintive cry, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. It was the possible loss of something more important than human life which moved him. The possible misapprehension of the sublimest influence of his career. This dread added the drop of gall to his cups. Here's how important the crucifixion and the resurrection are to us as Christian Scientists. All churches have tenets. They have rules, the rules of their church, the rules they live by. We need them. Probably some of them would fill volumes. Some of them might fill a book. Ours are 6 sentences. And of those 6 sentences, I pulled 2 of them. One is, as adherents of truth, we take the inspired word of the Bible as our sufficient guide to eternal life. And the other, we acknowledge that the crucifixion of Jesus and his resurrection served to uplift faith, to understand eternal life. Did you ever wonder why Jesus spent 3 days in that tomb? Kind of interesting. For one thing, it had been prophesied. Jonah had said, for just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So again, we have prophecy. But there was another reason that Jesus was well aware of. The Jewish tradition was that you didn't really leave this life for 3 days. That there was a spirit in man after he died, to all appearances, that remained alive for 3 days. So had Jesus emerged the next day or the second day, they would never have accepted the fact that he actually had died. This is important to us, and he knew it. Now let's get to the resurrection. Again, I quote the Bible, this time Mark. And when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome had bought sweet spices that they might come and anoint him. Now they want to bring some perfumed oils and things to just do whatever they could. They didn't know what they could do, but they've got a problem because they had put a huge stone, a boulder, a massive one, in front of the tomb. Can't you imagine why? What if some of those Christians come and steal his body and disappear with it and then try to convince everyone he rose from the dead? We can't have that, so we've got to seal that tomb really well. And very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came under the sepulchre at the rising of the sun. And they said among themselves, who shall roll away the stone from the door of the sepulchre? And when they looked, they saw that the stone was rolled away, for it was very great. And entering into the sepulchre, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, clothed in a long white garment, and they were scared. They were affrighted. And he saith unto them, be not affrighted. Ye seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. Were those the 3 most important words ever said on the face of this earth? The women didn't know what to believe. They were terrified, Could they believe this? He said, go tell the disciples. And they didn't. They didn't. They were scared. And then Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 devils, came. He told her the same thing. Go tell the disciples. She did. But they didn't believe her. Didn't believe her. It was too good to be true. In Christian Science, we believe only that which is good is true, but that's another story for another day, okay? After that, he appeared in another form to 2 of the men that they walked the road to Emmaus, talked to them. They couldn't believe it either. And then he went to a dinner with the disciples and upbraided them for their hardness of heart, that they had not believed. He even ate food and asked for certain food, showing them he was very much a human again. This was not some fantasy ghost that had come back. This was Jesus. This was him. And I've always been touched by this doubting Thomas business, because we all know that Thomas was the holdout there. And Jesus said to him, these are my own words here, but Thomas, come here, give me your hand. Come here. Now, put your hand in my side. And then Thomas said, oh, my Lord and my God. And Jesus said, Thomas, you're happy because you see me and believe. Happiest are those who do not see me and yet believe. And that's all of us, isn't it? Isn't it? There was another time, that the disciples had a session with Jesus. And I'm sure you know about this, but maybe not the significance of where it plays into the story. The disciples, 7 of them, not all of them, 7 of them, were out fishing. They'd fished all night. It interests me that, they'd been taught to be healers and preachers, and they went back to their comfort zone. They went fishing, okay? Maybe they were going to do all these other things later, but right now they were distraught, they were confused, so they went back to their comfort zone, and they were fishing all night and caught absolutely nothing. They weren't even doing too well in their comfort zone, okay? When they look over on the bank at the Sea of Tiberias, and they see this guy, and he calls out, he's fixing fish, and has a campfire going, and he's got some bread, and he says, hey, have ye any meat? And they answered him, no. He said, cast your net on the right side and you'll find. Okay, now wait a minute. If I were a fisherman, I thought about that. I've been fishing all night over here, and this guy tells me, how wide is the boat? I don't know, 6 feet, 10 feet? He says, if I put my net over here, I'm going to find. What kind of sense would that make? But they didn't challenge that for some reason. They cast the net over, and 153 large fish jumped in the net, and the net didn't break. 2 miracles in a row. Now we're thinking something. And John said, that's the master. There's something interesting about John. When you read the chapter on John, he refers to the beloved disciple. That's him, by the way. Okay, so anyway, John said, that's the master. And they said, it is. Oh, now they got to get to the shore as fast as they can. So they're paddling in, and Peter's so excited, he jumps out of the boat to try to wade in, and they get over to the bank and sit there. And again, my poetess, Jacqueline Shaw, wrote a poem about that moment. But I want to talk to you, before I get into the poem, about something that Jesus said that I can't incorporate into the poem. While they're talking on the riverbank, Jesus is primarily talking to Peter. And he asks him 3 questions. You may all know this story, but if not, I hope someone doesn't, because it's a great story. He says, Peter, son of Jonas, lovest thou me? Peter said, I guess, yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. You feed my sheep. That wasn't the end of the dialogue. Jesus says, Peter, son of Jonas, lovest thou me? Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. Third time. Peter, son of Jonas, lovest thou me more than these? He's getting a little peeved now. Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. Feed my sheep. Think, what happened with that dialogue? Was somebody hard of hearing in there? Okay. In the original language of the Bible, which is Aramaic, there are 3 different verbs for the word love. The bottom one is eros, E-R-O-S, from which you can imagine the word erotic, passion, lust has come. The next one up starts with P-H-I-L. It's philios. And from that you get the word philanthropy. These are good people. These are loving people. These are the Rotarians who fill up the baskets for the poor, okay? This is the guy who stops on the freeway to help you with your flat tire. This is the lady that brings you chicken soup when you don't feel well. These are good people. But at the very top is agape, the kind of love Jesus was giving us in that commandment. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind. And your neighbor as yourself, okay? Agape. So, Jesus asked Peter, do you love me? Using the verb form agape. And Peter answered, philios. That didn't answer the question. It's like a guy saying, I love you with all my heart. Will you marry me? I don't know. I'll think about it. It didn't work, okay? So Jesus comes back the second time. Do you love me? Agape. Second time, philios. Third time, one of them changes the verb form, and it wasn't Peter. Jesus, do you love me? Philios. Yes, I love you. Philios. Evidently, Jesus realized Peter wasn't at that time quite ready for that full commitment. So anyway, when they get to the shore, we have the poem that I said a minute ago I'd read to you or say to you, by Jacqueline Shaw, called The Morning Meal, subtitled The Doubting Thomas at the Sea of Tiberias. So it's kind of in Thomas's wordings. And she said, yes. Yeah, it was here. We pulled the boat up there, and here he made the fire. Oh, just such a morning as this. I remember his hands going to and fro, giving us the fish and the bread, and then the waters lapping. They lapped against the side of the boat, just as you could hear it, kind of a lap, lap, lap. We were so tired after the night. I sat in the grass and ate and watched those hands. It might have been the same as before, but it wasn't. Oh, I tried to pretend it was. I tried to pretend it never happened, that dreadful night, those days when all seemed lost, and then his coming again, it was like a dream, only I knew it wasn't. I knew, too, that when the light got stronger, he would go. What? No. I wasn't drowsy. I was wide awake, only it was so peaceful there. Heaven come down to earth. Oh, that was what it was. I heard him, and I seemed to hear everything else as well. Does anyone understand what I'm trying to say? I mean, a bird sang, and a caterpillar crawled across the grass, and it was new, and it was lovely, and still his voice went on. Oh, I think he was talking to Peter then, talking about love. I saw love. Oh, I saw what he meant. I saw that we were to be shepherds and fishers too. I looked up at him again, once more, into those well-remembered eyes. It was like sinking into a well of love, and I thought, I can do that. I can love. And all the hate and spite and bitter sense of weariness left. I didn't hate anyone. Not Herod, not Judas, not those soldiers, because I knew that the Christ was greater than them all. I knew I'd never fear again. I'd never do anything but love. It was like a light. Oh, a light so bright I had to close my eyes. And when I opened them again, he was gone. Peter and John were standing by the fire. It was ashes now. The fish and the bread were all done. John's head was resting on Peter's shoulder. I've never seen such a sad look before. But underneath, it was as if there was a mighty calm. I thought, oh, how like the Master John has grown. And then Peter said, come, gather up the catch. We have work to do. Happy Easter. Thank you. Thanks. Oops. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.